Do you have a bunch of existing infrastructure in Azure that you would like to start managing with Terraform, but you don't know where to get started? Well, today we're going to be covering a tool called Azure Terrafy that will help you with that import process. What's up, everybody? It's Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to another Terraform Tuesday. Today, we're going to be covering Azure Terrafy. And the name is not great, right? I get what they were going for. You're taking existing Azure infrastructure, you're bringing it into Terraform, you're terrifying it. So I get where they were going, but also, if you're writing a tool that you want to instill calm and confidence about, putting Terrafy in the name might not be your best option. I do have it on good authority. The name is probably going to change in the not too distant future, but for now, it's Azure Terrafy. Now, before we get into the tool and what it does and how it works, I have two quick things I want to mention. Number one, I've started a new podcast with my buddy Chris Hayner. It's called Chaos Lever, and we cover all kinds of things across the tech spectrum. So if you're interested in hearing more from me, some topics we've covered recently are SmartNICs, the fact that best practices don't exist, and a bunch of other interesting stuff. The website is chaoslever.com, and there's a link down in the description. The other thing I want to mention is if you're watching this before October 2022, which I know is very soon, HashiConf Global is coming. I will be speaking at HashiConf. I have two presentations, and one of those presentations will be based off of what's in this video, actually. It'll be my hallway track presentation. So if you can attend in person, that's awesome. There's also a virtual option that's free. Hope to see you there. Now let's get into Azure Terrafy by first looking at what options are out there when you want to import infrastructure into Terraform. Most people I talk to, when they're looking at Terraform, they already have resources deployed in one of the public clouds, and they ask me, a common question is, can I just hit like a big red button and import everything to Terraform? And for the most part, the answer's been no. You can't do that. There's a little more to it than just pushing a nice shiny button and spitting out a configuration that you can just start using. And there should be a little bit more to that. We'll kind of get to that later. But what are your options today? Well, if you want to use just pure Terraform, there's the Terraform import command. And all that command does is create the mapping in the state file of the resource to something that's in your configuration. You still have to write the configuration. So that's not a great experience, but it is an option. There is an experimental feature called Terraform Add that was introduced in 1.1. It's totally experimental, and I think it's been deprecated, so it didn't go very far. Outside of pure Terraform, there's a tool called Terraformer that was originally focused on GCP, though it does support other clouds. I did a short video on Terraformer and had a lot of trouble getting it to work with Azure, so your mileage may vary when it comes to that tool. There's a few other tools like it out there, and they're referenced in the documentation for Terrafy, so definitely check those out if they're of interest to you. There is one more I want to mention called Firefly, and I'll include a link to gofirefly.io. It purports to build the configuration, populate the state data, and actually create a more malleable or dynamic configuration than what Azure Terrafy can do or any of these other tools. I think it is a paid product, though I'm sure there's a free version. I haven't delved into it too far. Hey, if you're a Firefly person out there and you wanted to sponsor an episode where I do a deep dive, I'm definitely game. But let's take a closer look at Azure Terrafy and what it is able to do with your existing infrastructure. The tool that we're talking about is Azure Terrafy, and it is a tool that is maintained by Microsoft. It is available on GitHub. It is open source and written in Go, so if you want to contribute or just log issues, you can absolutely do that. Now, what does Azure Terrafy actually do? Well, you can point it at a single resource or a resource group in Azure, and it will analyze that resource or all of the resources in a resource group and do two things. It will generate a Terraform configuration for you that will be a valid, usable configuration, And it will also populate the Terraform state with the mapping of that configuration to the resources that exist in Azure. And as part of that polling process, it populates all of the attributes or properties of those Azure resources into the state data and your configuration. Now, I will say that configuration is going to be extremely literal, and we'll see that in a little bit when we get into the demo. It hard codes all of the values. It does have some idea of dependency, but beyond that, everything is pretty hard coded. So you're going to end up refactoring that code later. But at a bare minimum, it's going to try to give you a valid Terraform configuration and a valid Terraform state without you having to do a bunch of coding in Terraform. Now, that's the background of what it does. Why don't we take a look at it in action so we can actually see how it works? All right, let's dive into a Terrafy demo, and hopefully it won't be terrifying. I'll try to stop making that joke. It's so obvious, right? Okay, so what we're going to do in this is we're first going to create some infrastructure in Azure, and then we're going to import it into Terraform using Azure Terrafy. So the actual command line tool is aztfy, and I already have it installed. So let's just do an aztfy-v so we can get the current version of Azure Terrafy we're using. I'm on version 0.6, which was current as of last time I checked, but they are releasing these on a regular cadence, so it might not be current if you're using it. You can always grab the latest version if you go to the GitHub website. Here's the site, and if you go to releases, you can always find the latest release of this tool, which it is still 0.6 for me. Whenever you check this, it might be different for you. And download it from here for your operating system and put it somewhere in your path. So that's what I've already done on my system. So I have aztfy installed, and I have Terraform installed because it does leverage native commands in Terraform to do some of its work. So you need to have those two things already set up. Now, the files we're working with are in the directory 2022-0920 Terrafy, and you can always find these files on my GitHub repository Terraform Tuesdays. So in here, I have two directories. One's a setup directory. That setup directory has a Terraform configuration that you can deploy and then use Azure Terrafy to generate a new configuration using that. Now that might feel like cheating, right? I'm using Terraform to generate the resources, and then I'm using Azure Terrafy to import them, so I kind of know it's going to work. But let's do it a different way. Instead, we are going to do this using the Azure CLI to create our resources, and then use aztfy to import them into Terraform. I'll start by creating a resource group, and for that, I'm going to have two variables in here, RG name and location. So I'll set the resource group name to RG aztfy and the location to East US. Go ahead and do that now. All right, I've set those two values. Excellent. The next thing I'm going to do is create the resource group. And to do that, I'll run az group create, give it the name and the location. So let's start by doing that. And then once that resource group has been created successfully, we're going to run the second command, which is az vm create, and I'll pass it the resource group, a name, taco VM, an image of the LTS of Ubuntu, which I think will default to 1804, and we'll give it an admin username and generate SSH keys. So this is going to create the virtual machine, and implicitly, it also creates a network security group. It creates a subnet and a virtual network for that thing to exist in, and a network interface for it to use. So this one command actually creates a bunch of resources beyond just the virtual machine itself. So let's go ahead and kick that off and let it run. Now this is going to take a few minutes to actually provision this virtual machine. So I'll go ahead and jump to when the provisioning is complete, and we'll start running the aztfy commands. Okay, we have successfully created our Azure virtual machine in the resource group. And remember, that also includes the virtual network, the subnet, the network security group, and the network interface. So there's a bunch of additional resources to support that virtual machine. Now it's time for aztfy to do its thing. And the command that we're going to use is aztfy. We'll pass it the argument resource group that says we're going to import all resources from a resource group and then pass it the name of the resource group that we want to import. Remember, you can do this either for an individual resource or all of the resources in a resource group. And don't worry, you don't actually have to import every single resource in that group. It will give us a mapping of the resource in Azure to the potential resource in the configuration, and we can remove or modify any of those. Let's see what that looks like. So let me just give it a little more room at the command line because it does have some pretty pictures for us. And I'll go ahead and run that command. Okay, so it's going to go through a process here. First, it's going to initialize, and then it's going to reach out to the Azure subscription I currently have selected, and that's all using the Azure CLI authentication and settings. And then it's going to grab all of those resources and generate this list for me. And here's the list. So it found 8 items, including the resource group that it wants to import. And what it's showing here is the unique identifier for that resource in Azure, and then the resource type that it's going to create based off of that resource in Azure. So the first one is the resource group itself, and it's going to create an object in my configuration called Azure RM resource group .res-0. And you can customize the numbering and the prefix that it uses for the name labels for the resources. The next one down is the virtual machine, and it identified that as an Azure RM Linux virtual machine. It didn't used to do that, so that's actually a big improvement, is it looks at the operating system and correctly selects either Linux or Windows virtual machine. We also have a network interface, we have a network security group, we have a network security rule, a public IP address, the virtual network, and the subnet. So it mapped out all of these things for me. Now I have options here to import all of them, to make adjustments to this list if I want to. If I like everything I see, I can hit W, and that will go through the process of importing everything. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Now it's going through the import process. If it fails to identify properly one of the resources in Azure, it can't find which object to map it to in the Azure RM provider, then it will either give some recommendations. If you hit R, it'll say, these are the recommended types that I think might fit. Or if it has no idea, you can manually put in the resource type and the name for that resource. So you do have some options there, some latitude on how this process goes. Now, once it successfully imports all these objects, it's also going to create the state data. So let's expand the import directory where this is all happening and see what it has created so far. Excellent. We have a provider.tf file. So that's where it defines the providers being used by our configuration. It also has generated a terraform.tf state file. It also has created the .terraform file with our providers. So that means it already downloaded the Azure RM provider for us. Hey, that's pretty convenient, right? And it has this temp file .aztfy.tf where it's going through the import process. Once it's done, it's going to remove that file and create a new main.tf file that has all of the resources that are involved in our configuration. Now I've seen this take a few minutes, so let me go ahead and jump to when this completes, and then we'll take a look at the generated configuration and our state data. All right, it has successfully completed, and now it's prompting me to hit any key to exit out of Azure Terrafy. So I'll go ahead and exit out of that. And for now, let's just hide the command prompt and take a look at what's actually in our configuration. So in the provider.tf, probably as expected, it found the latest version of the Azure RM provider, and it added that explicitly into the required providers. In fact, the version is pinned to 3.14. I may want to be more general about that, and this is going to be sort of the beginning of the refactoring process. Maybe what I really want to say is just keep me on version 3.0. So I might update my configuration to include that keep it on 3.0 major version instead of being pinned to a specific version. Now let's take a look at what's going on in our main.tf. In this main.tf, looking at the first resource that's in here, it's the network security rule. And it has a name of res-4 because that's what it decided that particular resource should be. And everything in here, as you can see, is hard-coded. All of the rules are hard coded, and it creates a dependency because it understands that this rule belongs to a network security group. So it has to create that network security group before it creates this rule. Now, typically in Terraform, you would do that by referencing that network security group here through a reference to the other resource that you have in your configuration. And that helps Terraform build a dependency graph and just create things in the right order. Because the network security group name is hard-coded, it has to put this depends on to ensure that the network security group is created before the rule. And this is a common theme through the whole thing, right? Everything in here is completely hard-coded. It's not using any variables. It's not using any references to other resources. So it's really going to be up to you to go through this whole configuration and make it more dynamic, make it more reusable if you wanted to, and start adding some abstractions to this configuration. But at the bare minimum, it gives you a place to start. Now, in theory, it has populated this configuration, and if we look in terraform.tf state, it has also populated the terraform.tf state with the mapping of all of those configuration resources to the actual resources that exist in Azure. So because all of that's set up, if we bring back up the command prompt and do a Terraform plan, then it should tell us that no infrastructure changes are required, because right now our config is exactly matching what's in Azure today. So let's give this a second to finish. Okay, there we go. And as predicted, it says no changes. Infrastructure matches configuration, and that's awesome. We have successfully imported everything in a resource group into a Terraform configuration. There's some more work we have to do afterwards, but at the very least, we now have a starting configuration that we can work from. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the options with Azure Terrafy and some of the limitations of it. The way that I just used Azure Terrafy was in an interactive mode, but it also has a batch mode, and you can feed it a mapping file that maps the resources that will be in the configuration to the unique identifier in Azure. So you can do that. You can run it in a batch mode. You would still need to create that mapping file, so that's going to require some work from you. But if you don't want to run it in a pure interactive mode, you can do that. Also, remote backends are supported. In this example, I used a regular local backend just to keep things simple, but if you typically use the Azure Storage backend or Terraform Cloud or whatever you're using, those remote backends are 100% supported with this tool. Also supported is if you have an existing state and an existing configuration, you can append these resources to that state and that configuration with the append argument in the command. So that is also supported. Pretty cool stuff. Now, there are some limitations to this tool, and I definitely want to cover those. Number one, this tool only works with Azure. This is only for Azure resources. So if you have infrastructure in AWS or in GCP or in VMware, this tool is not for you, right? This is for Azure only. The next thing is it only supports one-to-one mapping of resources. What does that mean? There are some cases in the Azure RM provider where there's a resource type in the provider that is actually a property in terms of how the API is implemented on the Azure side. And so you may run into issues where the configuration that's generated skips over that additional resource you would typically need, and you'll have to add it in manually. Same thing with association resources. For example, if you have a data disk that's attached to an Azure virtual machine, you can define that directly in the virtual machine, or you can define that with an association where the disk is a separate resource. And then you generate an association resource to complete the circle. This tool is not going to create that association resource. It's going to directly map it to the virtual machine. So you may need to do some additional refactoring or work to get that, pinned down. So that's some additional limitations. The last one is that not all resources in the provider or in Azure are supported by this tool yet. There is a project called AZTFT that Azure Terrafy leverages to generate that mapping. And as that project gets updated, then the resources that are supported in Azure will also get updated. Just generally speaking, refactoring the configuration is extremely likely, and I would expect to do so after you use this tool. All right. Well, that will do it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Good news, I have lots more videos in the works beyond just this one. If you have a suggestion for a future episode, something that you want to know more about, definitely let me know. Probably the best way is through Twitter, because I don't always have a chance to read all the comments. I will say, one suggestion that I get is tell me how to use this specific resource or this property in this resource. That doesn't really make a great video. If you just have a question about how to use a resource, maybe just do that in a forum as opposed to me producing a whole video around it, because honestly, it's going to be a pretty short video and it may not even answer your question. So that's probably the better path to go. But if you do have a more general suggestion around how Terraform works or some tool that's related to Terraform that you want to see, let me know. I'm happy to cover it. That's going to do it for me for today. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, do all the things. Stay healthy, stay safe out there. Bye for now. So among my hobbies, I've started pickling and also making my own hot sauces. And I've been growing these pepper plants all summer. And this one has turned into a pepper mash that is currently fermenting in my office. And woo, it's got quite the smell. When you first walk in, it's quite noticeable, though you kind of goes nose blind to it after a while. But yeah, this is going to become delicious hot sauce in about 2 weeks. Cool stuff. All right, bye now.